The funeral, the homegoing service of Tyre Nichols. It was headlined by Reverend Sharpton. Did the eulogy and did a fine job. The proclamation of policy was front and center. Some have criticized individuals who would dare politicize a moment like this. I have some words for you, but allow me to give you a sentiment of what was expressed. Here it is.
What happened to Tyre is so personal to me, is that 5 black men that wouldn't have had a job in the police department would not ever be thought of to be in an elite squad. In the city that Dr. King lost his life, not far away from that balcony, you beat a brother to death. There's nothing more insulting and offensive to those of us that fight to open doors, that you walk through those doors and act like the folks we had to fight for to get you through them doors.
That was extremely appropriate, Reverend Al. Now, conservatives are crying foul. They're saying, oh my goodness, I cannot believe they are politicizing a funeral. Listen, first of all, for black folks, we don't call it a funeral. We call it a homegoing celebration because we believe the spirit returns back to where it came from. That is called a faith tradition. And the reality is at a service like this, whatever the family chooses is what's appropriate. That's how this works. Now, once again, Reverend Al Sharpton made a great point during that eulogy. The point was, it hits a little different when people you have fought for to have certain opportunities, get that opportunity, turn around, and then decide to treat black folk who sacrificed for you to have that opportunity the same way as the oppressor we fought to give it to you. Also, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke, and the brother, Mr. Nichols, spoke as well. Here it is.
My brother was really robbed of his life. You know, my brother didn't live up to the normal black man hype. A basketball player, football player, rapper, none of that, right? He set his own path. You know, he made his own light. He's seen the world way different than I've ever seen it before. And when I sit here and look at the screens of the work that my brother has done, and from the vigils, from people talking to me about my brother, I learned so much about him. And I don't think people just tell me this or be telling me, but my brother really touched a lot of lives. He was a very solid individual. He was very peaceful, he was very respectful.
During that service, it was the first time many of us were able to receive a full bio, basically, of Mr. Tyre Nichols, a gentle individual, made his own path, created his own light, and touched a lot of people. You see, when they say things like, it's not time to make it political, I need you to understand something. Tyre Nichols is dead because of politics. Tyre Nichols is dead because of politics. The politics that would prefer to protect corrupt cops rather than expose them. The politics created by the politicians who enact the policy that leads to the death of men like Tyre Nichols. The politics is already here. It is not escapable at this point. Now, remember, there are a couple of things that could have been done, at least in the spirit of transparency and in police accountability. We're gonna talk about that in just a moment. The funeral of Tyre Nichols, a black man who died after being beaten by police officers in Memphis, Tennessee, was marked by emotion, music, and a renewed call for justice on Wednesday, including by Vice President Kamala Harris. She said, and I quote, "This is a family that lost their son and their brother through an act of violence at the hands and the feet of people who had been charged with keeping them safe," Harris said at the service in Memphis. Now, you will notice that mainstream politicians are typically afraid to utilize a particular word when they say what happened. They don't want to say the phraseology, police violence. They won't say that, not police violence. They will say violence. They will say violence by those who were entrusted to not do this. But police violence will typically not go 1-2. That's called a measured response. If we're still being measured at this point, we're in trouble. Right now, you need an appropriate response to the inappropriate actions being visited upon Black and brown unarmed bodies. Harris, Sharpton, Crump, and Wales all called for the federal government and federal lawmakers to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. We've talked about it many times on this program, which stalled in the Senate in 2021 and would have introduced major changes to policing across the US, including the elimination of qualified immunity for officers. Services at the Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis were live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Now, I'm going to highlight once again what the George Floyd Act would have done. I'm going to highlight that in just a moment. But without the act, let me just allow an opportunity to present to you what the president of the United States could currently do without a law. Number one, he could actually eliminate federal funding for police departments who do not adhere to guidelines set by the federal government. Yeah, he can do that. He doesn't need a law in order to say our money, our rules, period. That's number one. Number two, he doesn't need a new law to instruct his Department of Justice to look into police misconduct in a way that the law allows. There's an allowance here through the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ. It takes emphasis, manpower, it takes an enhanced budget. It takes more leadership. But let's look at what the George Floyd Act would have done. Lowers the criminal intent standard from willful to knowing or reckless. Now that's a powerful one right there. It lowers the criminal intent standard for cops from willful to knowing or reckless. That's the standard that would apply to you and I. Please understand this. This is the standard we already have. Police, for some reason, have immunity with this standard. To convict a law enforcement officer for misconduct in a federal prosecution, it limits qualified immunity as a defense to liability in a private civil action against a law enforcement officer. As a matter of fact, most Americans agree with this one. And grants administrative subpoena power to the Department of Justice in pattern or practice investigations, meaning if you can establish a pattern of practice, then the DOJ has the right to come in and investigate and issue a penalty. Sometimes that penalty is civil. It establishes a framework to prevent and remedy racial profiling by law enforcement at the federal, state, and local levels. It also limits the unnecessary use of force and restricts the use of no-knock warrants, chokeholds, and carotid holds. That is something most Americans agree with. The bill creates a national registry. Now, this is where it gets somewhat murky as far as public opinion is concerned. The bill creates a national registry, the National Police Misconduct Registry, to compile data on complaints and records of police misconduct. It also establishes new reporting requirements, including on the use of force, officer misconduct, and routine policing practices, stops and searches included. But let me tell you the genius behind that rule. While some people have mixed feelings about a national registry of police misconduct, Please understand, you have a National Registry of Citizen Misconduct. It's called a criminal history file. The National Registry exists for you and me, but the police don't want to have one for themselves. There's a National Registry for the misconduct of medical doctors. There's a National Registry for the misconduct of virtually every profession. You can find who has engaged in industry misconduct, except for the police. These rules are different for them, and they should not be, is my point. It should not take an act of Congress to do something that every other professional group in America already does. There's more. Finally, it directs the DOJ to create uniform accreditation standards for law enforcement agency and requires law enforcement officers to complete training on racial profiling, implicit bias, and the duty to intervene when another officer uses excessive force. And I want to say this about the bias training and the excessive force training. A cop told me something. He's actually a leader in policing. And he said, it's not just the bias training or the sensitivities that we should be aware of. That's not what is effective in these trainings. It's showing cops what trouble they will get into that is effective. It's showing cops the cause and effect reality of violating these particular rights, because that's part of the training when they provide this level of bias, sensitivity, or racial profiling training. That's a good thing, because at least they are warned about a system that will hold them accountable. However, in practice, not so much. All right, Big Woz, what are your thoughts here, dear brother?
Man, so many things to speak on here. First, that you mentioned when conservatives are saying, don't make this political. The police, by definition, they're the state's sanctioned arm of violence, right? They're the only people allowed to legally carry out violence on citizens. They're granted that right by the state. So by definition, this is a political matter, right? Just the idea that you could separate this from politics is absurd. And I think another thing, the part that Reverend Al talked about, where it's disappointing when it's black guys, but quite frankly, I'm not surprised, because this is systemic. This is what the institution is. Those guys get in those institutions, they know who they can mess around with. They know who they can treat poorly, and they know who they can't, quite intimately, right? And I would even go as far to say they know which black people they can mess with, and which black people they can't mess with. They're not gonna go in, to some neighborhood and beat up a black doctor in an affluent neighborhood. They know better than that. They know the type of Negroes they could screw around with. And lastly, these guys are rational actors, Dr. Richey. These guys thought they could get away with it, and there's a reason for that. Because generally, as you mentioned, the issues that this bill would address, there's just a certain lack of accountability in all of policing all over America, especially when it concerns with how they police, marginalized groups of people and people who don't have voices in a community, people who can't raise a stink, people who can't get a congressman on the phone. People who can't get Channel 11 in their neighborhood on the phone, and make their voices heard. They know what they're doing. This isn't a mistake.
Yeah, you made a hell of a point. You said these individuals are rational actors. They know exactly what they're doing. They function. They go to work. They probably go to church. They have families, but they are inside of an industry that they believed would protect them in their misconduct. And at least initially, they were correct, because the cover-up started without a blemish until questions continue. We will continue to follow this, provide updates as they develop. More officers are under investigation still.